Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Adam Levine, and I'm the Executive Director here at the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, or NYMTC. As the Downstate Region's Metropolitan Planning Organization, NYMTC provides a collaborative planning forum where we address transportation-related issues and develop regional plans through our members' shared vision for the transportation network that connects New York City, Long Island, and the Lower Hudson Valley. Thank you all for participating in today's Brown Bag webinar. Please note that this webinar is eligible for one certification maintenance credit from the American Planning Association. You will find more information about this opportunity in the chat. Our guest today is Polly Desjarlais. Polly is the Content and Research Manager at the New York Transit Museum, where she has worked for almost 20 years. She hails from the United Kingdom, but made Brooklyn home in the mid-1990s and found a way to put her Bachelor of Arts degree in Historical, Political, and Philosophical Studies to use by joining the museum's education department. Being a lifelong city dweller, she is interested in how cities work and the role that urban transportation plays in their history and development. She has led hundreds of group tours, both virtually and in person, developed numerous school, group, and public programs, and was awarded an International Association of Technology and Management SkillBridge Fellowship in 2014. Most recently, I jumped ahead a bit on my notes, I'm sorry. Most recently, she joined the museum's archive to oversee research for both internal and external stakeholders. She is passionate about the history she is immersed in and making it accessible, fun, interesting, and relevant for everyone. Polly will be sharing stories from the New York Transit Museum, which turns 50 this year. We will learn about how the museum has captured New York's transportation history and culture over the past 5 decades, from its humble start in a decommissioned Brooklyn subway station in 1936 to its current status both as the largest museum in North America dedicated to mass transit and as a beloved cultural institution. As part of this event, and as always, I ask that you let us know via the chat who you are and where you are joining us from to help us learn more about our audience. And before I turn the microphone over to Polly, I'll just add a brief note that our Brown Bag program will take a summer break and will resume again in September with 2 webinars. First, a presentation from our September 11th Memorial Fellowship Scholars, and then an update on the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey's new Midtown Bus Terminal. You'll hear more on those webinars over the summer. Also, please check out our website, www.nimtech.org, for our brand new webpage dedicated to our Brown Bag series, where you can find information on and links to our previous webinars. Thank you again for joining us today, and I will now turn it over to Polly. Polly?
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you to NYMTC for inviting the museum to be a part of this. I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. Wait a sec. There we go. Okay. Now I need to share. All right. So 2026. It marks a few big anniversaries. So not only is it the semi-quincentennial of the United States, it's also the 90th birthday of the IND's Court Street Station, which of course became the home of the New York Transit Museum, which is celebrating 50 years this July the 4th. So we're almost at our birthday. I'm very, very glad to be able to share some of our story with you and some of the myriad stories from transit's past that we are privileged to tell. But before we truly dive in, I just wanted to show some clarifying information for those folks that might not be as familiar with some of the predecessor organizations and companies that oversaw the building, implementation, and operation of the transit system before the MTA took over in 1968. There are a lot of letter abbreviations in our history, which really helps when you have to write or say these names all the time. And I'm going to be referring to some of them during the presentation, probably most especially the predecessor subway companies, the IRT, BRT, BMT, and IND. So since the station came before the museum, let's take a quick look at the history of the place that became our home. Court Street Station was built as a spur of the IND, the Independent Subway System's Fulton Street line. Now, the IND system opened in 1932 with a portion of what is now, of course, the A line running under 8th Avenue in Manhattan, and of course, eventually it reached Brooklyn. Now, when Court Street Station opened in 1936, despite running a not quite 24-hour shuttle service called the HH to the next station down the line, it was intended to actually function in a larger IND system. But due to the economic downturn of the Great Depression and then subsequent focus on World War II that followed, the second system, as it was known, never really materialized. Now, this IND second system really would have been grand and provided many new routes, which are still discussed even to this day. One idea for Court Street was for it to serve as the terminal end for a Brooklyn local service that would be paired with the A Express that would head toward a future terminal at Euclid Avenue. Now, Euclid Avenue Station was not built until 1948, however. So, of course, when Court Street opened, this wasn't able to be implemented. Another proposal was related to the long-awaited Second Avenue subway, which, of course, was part of the IND second system. In 1939, a proposal actually had the line connect to the stub end of Court Street to provide Second Avenue trains with through service towards the coming soon Euclid Avenue station. But because Second Avenue didn't materialize, Euclid Avenue wasn't there until 48. Court Street just remained an awkward shuttle 3 blocks from the next station, again at Hoyt-Schermerhorn Street. As the downtown Brooklyn area really sort of lost its luster in the 30s and the 40s as a shopping destination in favor of the more accessible than ever Manhattan, ridership dwindled on the HH line. And on June the 1st, 1946, the station was abruptly closed and the shuttle service discontinued. But the station was decommissioned, but of course, as we've seen, it did not sit idle. And the Transit Museum story, however, really begins back in about 1965, a mere 61 years since the first subway trains had rumbled under Manhattan, and 50 since they'd first entered the borough of Queens. Now, an opportunity arose at the 1964 World's Fair in Flushing Meadows Park to celebrate this milestone and to showcase public transit and display vintage subway cars alongside the newest cars to begin service that year. So dignitaries from Manhattan rode into Queens on old IRT low V subway cars, which dated from the 19-teens and the 1920s. And then the Brooklyn contingent rode in from Coney Island on vintage BRT cars. I think they came in on the standards. And they all met at Queensboro Plaza Station, where both groups got off the old trains and boarded brand new R33 and R36 subway cars that they then rode into the fair. Now, later that day, the vintage cars were displayed at the Corona train yard. We can see that on the screen in full view for everybody to enjoy. And some of those vintage cars that were used for the event were later designated for the museum fleet. Now, on the slide in color, you can see the museum's R33S subway car, that means single, lovingly known as the Bluebird, and there it is on our platform. This is one of the most popular and colorful cars in the vintage fleet. Our curatorial team have dressed the cars with ads from just about the first decade that the particular class of car ran. So despite operating through the turn of the 21st century, this one looks like it's straight out of the 1960s. They really would have stood out in the lineup at Corona next to the older sort of quite drab train cars. And I like to think of these special World's Fair cars as the first subway trains that were really branded, dressed up for a very specific, albeit long-term event. But we love the Bluebird. So a couple of years after the World's Fair in 1967, a film director named Carl Reiner, you probably heard of him, was making a movie called Enter Laughing, set in New York City in the 1930s. Now, to make it as authentic as possible, Reiner shot on location, of course, and he paid the transit authority to charter a retired vintage IRT train, and he paid extra to ride and film for the entire day. Actor Jose Ferrer portrays a young man from the Bronx trying to make it as an actor in the big city, and the opening scene has him riding the subway from 176th Street station on the Jerome Avenue line in the Bronx into Manhattan. This particular film shoot helped the Transit Authority's Director of Public Information and Community Affairs, a man called Len Ingalls, and Public Information Officer Don Harold, justify setting aside old train cars in their quest to preserve the heritage of the transit system and to find a way to display it for the public. Now, next to the poster, you can see the type of train car that was used for the movie, an IRT low-V, meaning low voltage, car number 4902. And this is where, again, where it lives on the museum's platform. Now, this is the oldest IRT car in our vintage fleet. It dates from 1917. Ours is a trailer, so there aren't any motors underneath, and we don't move it out of the museum for rides, but we have many other low-Vs for that purpose. Now, my favorite thing about these cars is that they put a hole in the wall behind the motorman, the train operator, at the perfect height to allow light from inside the passenger car to illuminate the operator's controls inside the cab, providing extra light rather than having to add another light bulb inside the cab itself. Sometimes, honestly, the ingenuity of the workers, the engineers, the mechanics, just looking for an easy, elegant solution, it's just so wonderful, and often, you know, completely specific to a train car. But that was one of my favorite things about these cars. Now, Don Harold and many others spent the next few years adding to what we call the museum fleet by various means, including squirreling away cars in inconspicuous places, in train yards and the like, and potentially obscuring car numbers that were listed for scrapping. Now, some cars were chosen for their historical significance, like the very first IND subway car. Now, by the 1960s, its number had been changed, but the car's original number 100 was restored, and it became one of the core cars of the museum's collection. Here you can see it in 1976, making its debut on the platform. Just picture for a moment composer Billy Strayhorn sitting on this car, riding to see his friend Duke Ellington in Harlem, writing one of the most famous jazz standards in the world, Take the A Train. I'd sing it for you, but I'm not going to ruin your day. I mean, he could have been on any number of these trains known as the R9s, meaning R1 through R9 type subway cars, because he wrote that tune in 1939, which was a while after the A line first opened, but I like to think of him on our Car 100 doing that. And you know what? Car 100 is not the only highly significant piece of rolling stock in our collection. We also look after car number 8013, which is the last surviving car of a single 10-car train. Now, this R11 was produced in 1949 as a prototype for a planned 400-car fleet. New features included a welded stainless steel exterior, a built-in public address system, germicidal lamps, forced air ventilation, and crank-operated windows. It was really the height of modernity in 1949, but a full fleet was never ordered, mostly because they were intended for the new Second Avenue subway that didn't actually get built during this period. They didn't want to waste anything, of course. So the cars were all eventually rebuilt, and they changed their class designation to R34 at a cost of about $50,000 a car, which was about half of what it would have cost the authority to build brand new cars. I think actually that this train has one of the best exterior looks of any other. And my favorite thing, of course, is the round porthole windows. One day, back to the story. So one day in 1973, as plans and ideas for a museum had been cooking, Transit Site Inspector Richard C. Bauman conducted a review of certain agency properties that might possibly make for a good exhibition space. He highlighted the pros and cons of three possible sites. First, the IRT Old City Hall Station. When he visited, he found it to be even more beautiful than the pictures. But he noted that extensive work would have to be done in order for it to work as a museum. Now, this was one of the very first subway stations constructed and is certainly unique among subway stations. It opened in 1904, of course, but closed to passengers in 1945. It has a very, very short curved platform, which is unable to fit a 10-car train. In the 1990s, the station was again floated as a possible extension of the Transit Museum in Brooklyn, and some architectural renderings that you can see there on the screen were created to sort of help imagine it into being. However, the same limitations that existed in the 1970s were still limitations in the 90s, and they're still limitations today, like the fact that the station is actually an active loop track for the number 6 train, which turns itself back around and heads back uptown. Today, of course, you can visit Old City Hall Station on one of the museum's signature membership tours. They sell out in minutes, so you have to be really quick if you want to buy tickets. But this special members-only tour has really helped to grow our audience, and I think helped to sustain the sort of mystique and interest in this part of subway history. The station was designed by the original system architects, Charles Hines and Christopher Grant Lafarge. Now, at the time, these Beaux-Arts inspired architects were working on the Cathedral of St. John the Divine up in Morningside Heights on the Upper West Side, and they brought their church sensibilities downtown. With them came Spanish artisan Rafael Guastavino to create the beautiful vaulted arched ceilings. And they also brought with them controversial Danish-American sculptor Gutzon Borglum, most famous for Mount Rushmore, who created 3 commemorative bronze plaques that adorn the walls. It is always well worth a visit to come to City Hall Station. 2 other stations were considered for a museum space in 1973. The BMT City Hall Station, right on the Broadway line, still open today, of course, but the lower level. This platform wasn't really finished, and it was in poor condition, and it would have needed a lot of work again to get it in shape. And also, people would have only been able to enter from the upper level station, and that would have been quite interesting how that would have been managed. And finally, of course, the IND's Court Street Station over here in Brooklyn. Now, Bauman wrote that although there is nothing in its design that would make it stand out in a crowd, he found that it was a promising site for the museum for a variety of reasons. Firstly, it had remained relatively untouched since it had been last operated. It had original token booths, and the turnstiles were still intact and in place. And it had a full-length mezzanine and a platform where train cars and artifacts could be displayed. Fantastic. However, the main concern was that its location was a bit too out of the way. I guess downtown Brooklyn was quite different back then. In fact, I think one of the things that's best about the museum is that we are so close to so many transit lines, bus and subway. So getting here isn't difficult. And even though we don't yet have an elevator, we're an accessible space. So yeah, that was an interesting thought that we were too out of the way. There were other reasons actually that made Court Street Station the right choice for the museum. One of Don Harold's jobs at Transit, as we've seen, was dealing with all the filmmakers like Carl Reiner who wanted to make authentic movies here and were willing to pay for it. In 1974, both The Taking of Pelham 123 and Death Wish filmed scenes at the decommissioned Court Street station. Both, by the way, terrifically violent films, very indicative of their time period, and both have pretty harrowing scenes on the subway. But these Hollywood people, as Harold called them, were willing to pay substantial amounts of money to film. So the Transit Authority decided to sort of clean up Court Street Station properly, give it a coat of paint, maintain it, and this helped to solidify it as the best choice for an exhibition or a museum space. This scene from Death Wish, Charles Bronson looks so nonchalant reading his paper while he's being confronted on an R30 subway car. These started operating in the early 1960s on letter lines. Museum visitors really like the R30 car on our platform because of its weird mixture of colors, and I think the checkered floor tiles. It also has a tremendous amount of poles. And by the way, they also shot scenes at the museum for the remake of The Taking of Pelham 123, the one with, John Travolta and Denzel Washington I think it was in 2008. In fact, there are many, many film and TV scenes that have been shot in the museum over the years. You'd be surprised. I definitely have a few favorites, including a couple of really great SNL sketches. And it really continues to be a sought after backdrop for many location scouts. Sometimes it's easy to see it's the museum if you can spot the bright red columns. So 2 years later, in 1976, New York City Transit Authority president, a guy called John DeRuse, was presented with a plaque by the Transit Police Department, and it had vintage subway badges all over it from, the IRT and the BMT and the IND. Now, according to Don Harold, when he saw this, DeRuse sort of lamented that the Transit Authority didn't have a place where they could display this great plaque or any other sort of vintage transit materials, and chatted with Don Harold about what they could do. The very next day, DeRuse approved the museum, but he said it had to be opened in time for the bicentennial in July. So that meant they had just 7 weeks to put the New York City Transit exhibit together. So on May the 18th, Fred D. Wilkinson, who was the executive officer of passenger services, convened a meeting to discuss and delegate tasks between nearly 24 Transit Authority staff members from a variety of different departments. For example, maintenance of way had to come in and resolve problems of ventilation and lighting and electricity. Architect Paul Katz came in to advise on laying out the space and the object displays, the painting and the tiling work, as well as installation of air conditioning and restroom fixtures. Don Harold took the role of curator and chief train wrangler, and along with help from staff photographers, the stations department, and literally almost everyone else who was involved in setting up the exhibit, helped to find artifacts and photographs to put on display. Cars and Shops supervisor Mike Hanna, with others, organized the transfer and the maintenance of the train cars that then went on display, and they did that from the Coney Island maintenance yard. Food concessions were set up. Yes, if you can believe it, there was a Nedix hot dog stand and a retail display of souvenirs and memorabilia. And security was provided by the transit police and the special inspections team. Now, though Don Harold was really a driving force, it took more than 120 people contributing in some way to open the exhibit. So really not enough time or space to mention each one of those people individually. Now, part of the exhibit's programming was Harold's great idea for a vintage train ride for visitors that he dubbed the Nostalgia Special. The train cars weren't quite ready at the July opening, but by August 1976, for $3 for adults and $1.50 for kids, people could ride on an old BMT triplex car, as you can see on the left of the slide, or a BMT standard from the IND's 57th Street station in the city, and they would ride down to the museum where they could enjoy the exhibit for an hour or so before they would reboard and then take a further ride out to the Rockaways and then come back again. I know. This special train ran almost every weekend through Thanksgiving and each year from 1976 until 1980. And really, this began the tradition of offering rides on the vintage fleet, which of course we still do today. In fact, there are more chances than ever to ride vintage trains. Not only do we run special day-long rides out to fun destinations in the summer and fall months, we host the holiday train that runs every weekend between Thanksgiving and the end of the year in regular service, right? And Parade of Trains, which is our annual free subway event out at Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, which we run each June. So lots and lots of opportunities to ride old trains. The founding fleet on display at the museum in 1976 included many of the cars we've already seen on the slides, but it was a very special year, just like 2026. And so they displayed brand new R46 cars in this wonderful bicentennial livery, which had a special bicentennial MTA logo to boot. 50 years later, we're just about to retire these very cars. Now, we don't yet have an R46 on display, but we do have an R44, which is virtually identical. And of course, as you can see on the slide, sports the famous orange seats. It's not only the longest train car in the collection at 75 feet, it was also clocked as the fastest class of New York City subway car ever recorded. In a special speed trial thing that it did out on Long Island, it reached a whopping 87.5 miles per hour. And about those soon to be retired orange seats, our newest exhibition, Ode to the Orange Seats, was a huge hit on opening night, which was just last week, comprising the works of 14 independent artists, many of whom are New Yorkers themselves. We see the way that something as humble and ordinary as a plastic seat on a train car can inspire such wonderful creative expression. MTA chairman Jano Lieber is shown here checking out the incredibly lifelike miniature of those orange seats by artist Danny Cortez. It was a really great night, actually. So by February 1977, the exhibit was seeing so much traffic and was so well received by the public that the Transit Authority announced that it would remain open indefinitely. Now, lucky 9-year-old Christine Motley from the Bronx was the 100,000th visitor to the museum in June of that year, and she won a very cool BMT t-shirt, as you can see. By January 1982, less than 6 years after its opening, 8-year-old Igor from Flushing in Queens became the 500,000th visitor to what was now being called a permanent transit showcase. And the museum welcomed its 1 millionth visitor on Tuesday, April the 19th, 1988, which just proved the continued overwhelming interest in the city's storied transportation history. By the mid-1980s, as the exhibition officially became the New York Transit Museum, and by the way, not New York City Transit Museum, very purposely New York Transit Museum, because we represent transportation in the region, not just in the city. So Terry Rouse was appointed as museum director, and a sort of new chapter began. Whereas the exhibit had opened with really only non-museum professional personnel from the Transit Authority itself, by this time, government relations management at the MTA really understood that the museum represented a wonderful opportunity to reach the public and share its rich history, and that it deserved a staff of museum professionals, including, you know, someone to manage the archive and develop a collection system, someone to develop and carry out educational programs, and someone to manage exhibitions. In the early 1990s, public support helped keep the museum open during a statewide budget crisis, and the museum eventually became financially independent, using Friends of the New York Transit Museum for fundraising support. The MTA appointed Gabrielle Schubert as the new museum director in 1991, and she had a full-time staff of just 3 people. Gabrielle would go on to lead the museum for almost 25 years. An early initiative was instituting one of the museum's most beloved events of the year. On top of all the subway stuff, we work with buses, of course, Bus Festival, which started its annual run in 1992, highlighting the vintage double-decker buses in the collection, amongst many other favorites. In addition, the first Transit Museum store opened in 1993 in Grand Central Terminal. Our current gift shop, a gallery space there, opened in 1999, and it offers, more opportunities to delight visitors and, importantly, casual travelers that might not make it all the way down to Brooklyn. And particularly during the winter holidays, when we put on our holiday train show, possibly the very last free model train show of its kind in New York City. And, if you've been before, it's really beloved, but know that we sort of add new characters and sometimes new buildings. So it's always worth stopping by to do the scavenger hunt and your holiday shopping all at the same time. So that happens in November. We put that show up. Since then, we've really never really slowed down, but continued that knowing and understanding the city and region's transit history is still a draw and a fascination for generations of New Yorkers and visitors alike. So for the remainder of our time together, I'm sort of going to share some of the highlights from our new exhibit to sort of whet your appetite to come and visit the museum in person, or to come to a program, or come on a nostalgia ride, or even make a research appointment at the archives. 50 Years of Stories showcases the museum's collections and the myriad narratives they hold beyond what's obvious and can just be seen on the surface. From exhibitions to retail products to public programs and school tours to social media and marketing. Now, the train cars themselves, of course, are time capsules and the most obvious fodder for a great story. But what about the other objects that reflect the history of the transit system in some way? For example, we have over 400 pieces of decorative ceramics in the collection, mostly from subway stations throughout the city. Now imagine the stories that they could tell if they could talk, of all the things they've witnessed and heard over the last century and a quarter. The original 28 stations of the IRT are some of the most ornately decorated and were influenced by the ideals of the City Beautiful movement and Beaux-Arts style. Many of the motifs and design elements are very much of their time, though, and perhaps it's a bit hard to fathom their symbolism or significance today. For example, eagles and eagles with shields were commemorative of the military, and at the time, when the subway first opened in 1904, there were several armories around the city. At 33rd Street and 4th Avenue, now Park Avenue South, in the Murray Hill section of Manhattan stood the 71st Regiment Armory. And so this symbolic image made sense to adorn the 33rd Street subway station, connecting early riders as to what was above ground. In the 1900s, when many of the original IRT stations were given landmark status, efforts were underway to preserve historic decorative elements that had been damaged over time, as you can see the eagle head. So pieces were removed, molds were created, and reproductions were made that you can see on the right side of the screen. But heritage preservation isn't the only story, of course, that these lovely pieces of ceramic can tell. What about the story of how this section of the subway was built? Pieced together with documents and archival photographs from our collection, we're able to tell rich narratives. Listen to this. 33rd Street Station, again, one of the original 28 IRT stations. Now, construction of the line was divided into sections, and those sections were built by subcontractors. Now, as construction entered its second year in January of 1902, some loose papers started a fire inside a powder house at Park Avenue and 41st Street, which housed lots of dynamite. That unlucky subcontractor, a man named Major Ira Shaler, he was using it to drill and blast through the bedrock underneath Park Avenue. The massive explosion caused widespread destruction of property, including the Murray Hill Hotel, which you can see there on the left side of the screen, where 2 employees and 1 guest were killed. 3 other people were also killed, an engineer and a mechanic who were working in the tunnel, and another young man. Over 100 other people were injured, some due to flying glass and masonry. Ironically, the subway tunnel itself wasn't badly damaged, and the accident didn't hold up continuing construction. In February of that year, February 1902, another fatal fire began, this time in the 71st Regiment Armory that we just saw. Workers inside the under construction tunnel were credited with raising the alarm and saving the janitor and his family, whom they rescued from the burning building. Now, despite great efforts, the fire spread to car barns at the Metropolitan Railway Company and to the Park Avenue Hotel via the elevator shaft, in which 17 people lost their lives, some of whom jumped to their deaths from the 6th floor. I know, unbelievable, right? The very next month, March 1902, there was yet another accident on Shaler's section of the subway. This time there was a cave-in along Park Avenue between 37th and 38th Streets. Now, this collapse didn't injure anybody, but it caused severe damage to the houses, as you can see in the subway construction photograph collection image there on the right side of the screen. The accident didn't delay work on the tunnel too much. And then finally, June of 1902, Major Shaler, alongside William Barclay Parsons, the chief engineer of the Rapid Transit Board, and his deputy, were inspecting a section of the tunnel at about 40th Street. Now, they'd been debating how best to shore up the roof of this section since the rock had been proving to be pretty unstable. They were inspecting one particular boulder that looked a bit precarious. Parsons poked a stick into it and stepped back to see what would happen. And despite knowing that he should stay under a protected roof, Major Shaler stepped out under the unprotected section, and the rest of the boulder came tumbling down and buried him in about a ton of rock. Now, Parsons and his deputy were safe and untouched, inches away. And as he lay there in agony, stoic as ever, he exclaimed that he thought his back was broken. Eventually, he was taken to the hospital, where he died in agony 12 days later. So what a story that one mosaic can tell us. Poor Major Shaler. But I had promised these guys that I would focus on positive stories. So now that I've broken that promise, I'm going to try and focus on something positive. So as you've seen, the museum's collection includes thousands of objects and about 500,000 photographs. And then there's still all the other kinds of ephemera. For example, within the museum's archives are decades worth of ideas and suggestions sent into the powers that be, including the State Transit Commission, the Mayor's Office, the Board of Transportation, and the Transit Authority. Now, these ideas came from a variety of people and companies that proffered solutions to perceived problems. 100 years ago, in the 1920s, a favorite topic was the severely overcrowded conditions on public transportation. I mean, not for nothing, and growing street congestion as we add more cars and things to the streets. Now, many of the ideas involved going up above the streets rather than going down and under them. These ideas were reflected in the popular culture of the time, like science fiction movies, themselves really new technology, like, as you can see on the screen, Fritz Lang's Metropolis. The three proposals from the collection that you see on the slide, the Tigerman Suspension Railway, the Lafferty Airway Transportation System, and Henry Swift's monorail, all of them envisioned an elevated rail system of some kind. And some of these proposals far more detailed and ambitious than others. The Lafferty system, for example, envisioned using existing infrastructure like the East River bridges in a whole new way, as you can kind of tell from the illustration. And these folks weren't totally crazy, by the way. There was precedent for some of these ideas, like what we see on the screen. This is the Wuppertal Schwebebahn. By the way, one of my favorite things to say ever. The Schwebebahn, the oldest electric elevated railway with hanging cars in the world. It was invented by a brilliant German engineer, Eugen Langen, who did pioneering work on the internal combustion engine in the mid-19th century. Now, the Schwebebahn first opened in 1901, and it is still in use today as a local public transit line. It moves about 80,000 people every day along a 13-kilometer line that has 20 stations, all but 4 of which are above the river Wupper. The cars are suspended from a single rail built underneath a supporting steel frame. So, though we look back with hindsight and declare that these proposals, these ideas are non-viable for New York City, I mean, imagine how people first felt about the idea of going underground and riding in tunnels. It was new and it was kind of scary, and I'm sure there were many back then who thought that the subway was more science fiction than a probable reality. But here we are today. And finally, and maybe most importantly, within the collection are all the stories of people: engineers, planners, politicians, passengers, and everyone in between. I often lead tours of the museum for various departments at the MTA, and I remind those folks that not only is this their museum, but that they might be on the walls one day. Any of us might be, right? Public transportation, as we know, is the great equalizer, and it touches the lives of almost everyone who lives in the city and the region. But transportation, moving people, it's universal. Most people, no matter where you live, have some experience with a car or a bus or a train. So making connections to people's lives and showing them how the past, present, and future of transit is important and relevant to them is not really very difficult. And truly, some of the best stories that we tell are about people. From the pioneering civil rights action of Elizabeth Jennings Graham, who was ejected from a streetcar in 1854 and sued that company, winning a monetary award and beginning the end to segregated public transportation in New York City. To Richard Creedon and Marshall Mabey, brave sandhogs that survived devastating blowouts during construction of the first East River subway tubes. To Amelia Opdyke Jones, a graphic artist who created an iconic courtesy campaign advertised on the subway for decades. All these people had an impact on how we travel today, and they are just a drop in the bucket. We really have just so many more important stories to tell. And so I just wanted to say thank you so much for hosting me and letting me share the history of what I think is the best museum in New York, and just some of the work that we do. I hope you can all come and visit us in person or find a way to engage and interact with us in some way. And I want to thank all of you for the important work that you all do. So thank you.
Oh, that was terrific. Thank you, Polly. Yeah, I see some applause going up.
Thank you.
I think everybody really is enjoying this. I didn't know if maybe you touched on this, but I know we've got some comments and questions in the chat, but
Sure.
I just wanted to check. Are there any, maybe you mentioned this, are there specific 50th anniversary events that are happening this year? Or I know you've got the 50 years of the Transit Museum Instagram, and I maybe LinkedIn, TikTok, I don't know, other
Yeah.
posts, but anything
Yeah,
else?
we have we have our fabulous social media campaigns.
Yeah, you do.
We have a fantastic scavenger hunt of the city, and so there's an app, the Transit Museum's first app. So if you go to the App Store and you search for the New York Transit Museum, you're going to find a really fun, lots of sort of engagement that you can do all summer. We are going to be open for the first time on our birthday on July the 4th. So
Ooh.
not this weekend, but the coming weekend. We're open July 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And if you show up and you manage to get a ticket, we are taking the train from the museum to Hoyt-Schermerhorn Street and back. So we are bringing back the Court Street shuttle on Saturday and Sunday on the 4th and the 5th. And then in the fall, in September, we are going to have an event, a public event in the museum dedicated to the 50th. That will be something based in the 70s, something fun and sort of 76.
That's really great. I loved seeing some of the preparation. I mean, it looked like the plans for the museum, as you said, dated back several years before
Yes,
1976. But that memo, I think, was in 1973, where they were really getting,
yes.
serious about. So they were looking ahead and it referenced the bicentennial. So yeah, they were definitely trying to get it in place by then. That was terrific. 7 weeks, though. My goodness,
7 weeks, not enough time, right?
not enough time.
I know.
So I've got a couple of questions
Sure.
that are a little lighter, I guess. You mentioned favorite movie down in the subway. I certainly have my own personal favorite. You put the poster up for it, the original Taking of Pelham 123, because I was a child of the 70s, and so that's the subway system that I grew up in and had quite a bit of affection for, as perhaps crazy as that might have been. Um, but I don't know, what were these SNL skits or other favorites that you were referencing?
My favorite SNL skit. Gosh, how old is it? It's definitely 21st century. It's called Lil Peanut, and it's a parody of Showtime that occurs on the train sometimes. And it was when all the Hunger Game movies came out. Josh Hutcherson, who was the star of those movies, came to the museum with two of the folks at SNL, and they did this really hilarious sketch about Showtime. I don't know what the sketch is called, but he's called Lil Peanut, and I've been able to find it when I search Lil Peanut and Josh Hutcherson. But it's hilarious. I had fun that day when they were filming in the museum. It was fun.
Gonna definitely be Googling that after we're done here. And I'll just mention that my own personal favorite of the orange seats, I know is probably the least favorite, is I think it was designated seat number 4, the window seat.
That's my favorite.
Okay.
That's the best seat,
That's the
Heaven.
best seat. I
Yes.
think a lot of people were trying to be on the edges, but you got to be right in the middle there. It's so great. Anyway, Stephanie, I think we've got quite a few comments. I hope you can
We
maybe
do. We do.
get
This
us
is
through
so
them.
great, Polly. We're getting so much fun. And people are sending stories too.
I love it.
Right now, it's more story. I'll just sort of start with the stories. The R46 that you mentioned, someone said that was my ride, but if the museum can't get one, an R44 will do.
Great.
And then another, the different rides. I still have a soft spot for the R32s. And
Yes.
then another one about if you're up for traveling to New York City and want to ride an R46, you may want to ride on the Broadway line. The model can be found on the N, Q, and W lines. We have a lot of
Not for
transit
much
people.
longer.
Not for much longer.
Not
So,
for much longer.
I'll
Oh,
just I'll
grab
just
your
say
ride now.
it
yeah,
does not
grab your
go
ride
80.
now. Exactly.
It does not go 87 and a
You're
half miles
speaking.
an hour on that
It
on that.
does
I'm
not.
sorry. It
It
does
does
not. It
not.
it kind
It
of
really
crawls from my
does.
experience.
Absolutely.
Sorry to
Especially with,
interrupt you, Stephanie.
yeah, the
That's
R,
okay.
the
You're
rarely.
you're you're really talking to the right audience here. We're like, okay. Then we actually have a question. I think
Okay.
I've taken several of the vintage train rides and always wanted to know. Some of the passengers on the vintage trains are dressed in the period the train was in service. Are those people New York Transit Museum plants, or are there people doing this independently?
Oh no, those are independent folks. They are actually, a really core part of our audience come and really want to interact when they know that they can fully immerse themselves. So we have another event at the end of the year called Subway Swing, when the Swing Society of New York collaborate with us, and we bring swing bands and swing dancers to the museum. That brings our space alive. So if you've ever wanted to swing dance or just dress sort of 30s or 40s, that's a perfect night. Millions of photographers come out. It's like Instagram heaven, if you like that kind of thing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, by the way, so that I can be with you.
When is that? That sounds like so much fun.
That is always towards the end of the year. I'm not actually sure if we know when we have our final date for that yet, but towards the end of the year. Check the museum's website.
Yeah, and I signed up for updates, so I'll be getting it. I'm so excited. Okay, then other comments, just thanks, great presentation. There was another person said, very interesting, thank you. My daughter would love to work for a museum like this. She graduates St. John's in December. Is there someone she should reach out to? Thank you again. So hey,
yeah, always check the website. We have a section for jobs and careers on the website, folks. So please check.
Fantastic. Another question about when you mentioned the name choice as the New York Transit Museum being broader than just New York City, does that mean, does it feature other systems like the PATH?
No, we stick to MTA. So we represent, Long Island Railroad, Metro North Railroad, New York City Transit Authority, bridges and tunnels. But so that's our purview, really, sort of the MTA's region and the MTA's stretch. I mean, I would love to talk about PATH a little bit. I love the Hudson Tubes and some of the old stations, and of course, it's all sort of shared. We were doing everything at the same time, so lots of shared interests. But our scope isn't PATH.
We need to make one in New Jersey.
Yeah.
Okay. Another thank you for a great presentation and educating us about the fascinating story of the subway lines. And then, someone just answered the question about the people in costume. Someone said, answering on behalf of Polly, that the people dressed in vintage outfits on the trains are doing that on their own. There is a strong vintage community in the city, and many of them come to our annual Subway Swing event at the museum, which you just talked about. So
yeah,
it's very cool.
Absolutely.
This was so much fun. Such a great way to kick off summer. This was great. And that's all the chat questions that I see right now. Right. So, and I'll put one more time the link for. This is for one certified maintenance planning credit. If you have AICP, I'll put it in the chat again for anyone who didn't get it the first time.
And our website is nytransitmuseum.org. Please stop by. We've got fabulous stuff, and the whole history of the museum's origins and everything is there. So really, it's a fabulous website.
Put it in the chat too. Here we go. Awesome.
Thank you.
Of course.
As we're giving folks a last chance to put any comments or questions in the chat, I was curious if you could, Polly, kind of walk us through what days is the museum open?
Sure, of course.
How much it costs to go?
Absolutely. We are still the most affordable place in the city. $10 for adults, $5 for kids. You can reserve your tickets ahead of time online. But that's, walk-up tickets are usually always available. We're pretty busy at the weekends. We're open Wednesday through Sunday. So we're just closed Mondays and Tuesdays, 10 until 4. We close a little earlier than some other museums in the city, but for really good reasons. So between 10 and 4.
Okay.
Fabulous. Really Thank you so much.
Thank you so much again for inviting us to be a part of this. It was so much fun.
Yes, that's awesome.
Any last comments in the chat, Stephanie? Are we all done?
No, I just put a link to along with the AICP credits for your museum, and also the link to sign up for your newsletter, because that's where the people find out all the great stuff, and we're getting lots of hearts and applauses. So, Polly, thank you so much.
Very welcome. Thank you, guys. Take care. Have a wonderful summer.
Thank you, Polly. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Take care.
Thank you, Polly.
Thank you.